Welcome back for another episode. I hope I can help you fall asleep faster. Before we start, please consider subscribing to my channel. I have noticed that 80% of my viewers are not subscribed. Let's start. Sheila Sharp walked back to cabin 28, the morning of April 12, 1981. It was quiet, the kind of quiet a small mountain town gets after rain, and she had church clothes to change into. She had no reason to expect anything different from any other Sunday morning. Within minutes, 3 people inside that cabin would be dead, and a 12-year-old girl would be gone without a trace. How does a family disappear into violence like this, in a town of fewer than 50 people? And why, more than 4 decades later, has nobody ever been charged? Tonight we're going back to that morning, and to everything that came before it, and everything that came after. Let's get to it. To understand what happened in that cabin, you have to understand who Sue Sharp was, and why she came to Keddie in the first place. In the summer of 1979, Sue Sharp left Connecticut with her 5 children. She'd separated from her husband, James, and she wanted distance, a fresh start, somewhere her kids could grow up without the weight of a broken marriage following them into every room. Her brother Don lived in Northern California, so that's where she went. It's a common enough story, a mother rebuilding a life for her family in a place she barely knew, but the geography here matters. Northern California, in the late 1970s, meant small towns, long stretches of forest, and a kind of isolation that could feel like peace or feel like exposure, depending on the night. At first, Sue and her children settled into the Claremont Trailer Village in Quincy, a modest place, tight quarters for 6 people. It was a rental her brother had used before her, and it worked for a while. But a trailer isn't built for a family of 6 long term, and by the fall of 1980, Sue had found something bigger. A house had opened up in a place called Keddie, about 6 miles up the canyon from Quincy. It belonged to the outgoing county sheriff, and it had room enough for her children to have their own spaces. She rented it. It was called Cabin 28. Keddie itself deserves a moment of description, because the town shapes everything that follows. It had been built decades earlier as a railroad resort, a stopping point along the Western Pacific Line, with a hotel and cabins meant for travelers passing through the Sierra Nevada. By 1981, that resort era was mostly gone. What remained was a scattering of cabins, a general store, a bar called the Backdoor Lounge, and a population that hovered somewhere under 50 people. In a town that size, everyone knows everyone. You know who's married to who drinks too much, who's struggling, who's kind. There's no anonymity in a place like Keddie, and in hindsight, that closeness would matter more than anyone could have predicted. Sue's 5 children ranged widely in age. John, the oldest, was 15, a teenager finding his footing with friends in Quincy. Sheila was 14, close in age to John, but with her own circle, her own plans most weekends. Tina was 12, the middle child, and by all accounts a quiet, unassuming presence in the house. Rick was 10, and Greg, the youngest, was just 5 years old. It was a full household, loud in the way families with 5 kids tend to be. But by the spring of 1981, they'd been in cabin 28 for about half a year, long enough to feel settled. Their neighbors became part of that daily fabric. Next door, in cabin 26, lived Martin and Marilyn Smart, along with Marilyn's son from a previous relationship, a boy named Justin, who was close in age to Rick and Greg, and often played with them. A few doors down, in cabin 27, lived the Seabolt family, who Sheila had grown close with, close enough that sleepovers there were routine. This was the rhythm of life in Keddie that spring. Kids moving freely between cabins, neighbors keeping half an eye on each other's children, a kind of watchfulness that comes naturally in a town where the nearest real town is a 6-mile drive down a canyon road. Nothing about this life suggested danger. It was ordinary in the specific way that isolated, small communities can be ordinary. Quiet mornings, familiar faces, the same handful of neighbors passing in and out of each other's days. That ordinariness would not last past the second week of April. April 11th, 1981, started the way most Saturdays did for the Sharp family, with errands and small logistics filling the morning hours. Around 11:30 a.m., Sue, Sheila, and 5-year-old Greg drove out from a friend's place, the Meeks family, headed toward Quincy to pick up Rick from baseball tryouts at Gansner Field. It was the kind of task that fills a parent's weekend, nothing more, a car ride down the canyon to collect a kid from practice. On the way, they spotted John and his friend Dana Wingate hitchhiking near the mouth of the canyon. Dana was 17, a friend from Quincy, and the two boys had been out and about that morning. Sue pulled over, the boys climbed in, and she drove them the 6 miles back up to Keddie. It's a small detail, but it matters, because it places John and Dana at the cabin early that afternoon. Safe, accounted for, nothing unusual in the air. That didn't last. By around 3:30 that afternoon, John and Dana were hitchhiking again, this time back down toward Quincy. They may have had plans to see friends there, the kind of loose teenage plans that don't get written down anywhere. They were spotted downtown sometime after that, and as far as anyone has ever been able to piece together, that's the last confirmed sighting of either boy before they returned to cabin 28 that night. Think about how ordinary this all sounds. A baseball tryout, hitchhiking rides, boys wandering downtown on a Saturday afternoon in a town where everybody's parents know everybody else's kids. There's nothing here that raises an alarm, nothing that would make you look twice. And that's exactly the problem with reconstructing a night like this one. The hours leading up to a tragedy rarely announce themselves. They look like every other Saturday that came before them. By evening, the household began to scatter in its usual way. Sheila left cabin 28 a little after 8 p.m., walking the short distance to cabin 27 to spend the night with the Seabolt family, just as she had many times before. Tina had been over there too, watching television with the Seabolts, comfortable in a neighbor's living room, the way kids are in towns, small enough that every house feels a little bit like home. At 9:30 p.m., Tina asked what time it was. Then she walked back to cabin 28, back to her mother, her 2 younger brothers, and Justin Smart, the neighbor boy staying over that night. It's such a small, forgettable exchange. A kid asking the time before heading home. Nobody thought anything of it. Nobody had any reason to. What happened in the hours after Tina walked back through that door is still, in some form, being pieced together more than 40 years later. For now, picture the house settling into night the way houses do, in places without streetlights, without traffic, without much noise at all, beyond wind moving through pine trees. The lights stayed on inside cabin 28. Somewhere behind those windows, in the hours after 10 p.m., the last ordinary night the Sharp family would ever have was already coming to an end. Sheila walked home from the Seabolts around 8 a.m. the next morning. She had church clothes waiting for her at cabin 28, and that's all this was supposed to be. A quick stop before Sunday. She opened the door. The smell hit her before her eyes adjusted to what she was looking at. In the living room, 3 bodies lay on the floor. Her mother, her brother John, his friend Dana. Sheila was 14 years old, and in the space of a few seconds, the world she'd woken up into stopped existing. The scene investigators would later document was methodical, in a way that's hard to reconcile with how quiet the night had been. All 3 victims had been bound with medical tape and lengths of electrical cord, materials that hadn't come from a struggle, materials somebody had brought with them or gathered with purpose. John was found near the front door. Dana lay close by, his ankles tied to John's with wire, the 2 of them connected even in death. Sue was found partially covered by a blanket, near the couch. The injuries to her head and throat consistent with a level of violence that investigators struggled to explain, given how little sound had apparently escaped the house. Deputy Hank Clement was among the first officers on scene, and what he documented went beyond the bodies themselves. Blood wasn't confined to where the victims lay. It marked the walls, the ceiling, the furniture, the soles of shoes, the back steps leading outside. To Clement and the officers working the case in the days after, this spread told its own story. The victims hadn't simply fallen and stayed where they fell. Somebody had moved through that room after the killing was done, repositioning bodies, touching surfaces that should have stayed untouched. Whatever happened in that living room happened in stages, not in one single act. And yet, a few feet away, in the room right next to that carnage, 3 children slept undisturbed. Rick, 10 years old, and Greg, just 5, along with the neighbor boy, Justin Smart, were found in a back bedroom, physically unharmed. Whatever violence had taken place in the living room had stayed in the living room, close enough to reach them. Close enough that a wall and a door were the only things separating 3 sleeping children from what had happened to Sue, John, and Dana. Sheila didn't stay in that house any longer than she had to. She ran back to the Seabolts, and Jamie Seabolt moved fast, pulling Rick, Greg, and Justin out through the bedroom window rather than walking them past the living room. But before that, Seabolt made a choice that would complicate the case for years afterward. He went in through the back door of cabin 28 to check if anyone inside might still be alive. It was an act of instinct, the kind of thing almost anyone would do for a neighbor. It also meant another set of footprints, another presence moving through a scene that investigators would need, later, to read with total precision. What nobody realized yet, in those first chaotic minutes, was that the count was wrong. 3 bodies were in that living room. 3 children were unharmed in the bedroom. But Sue had 5 children, and only 4 were accounted for anywhere in that house. Tina was gone, and for a stretch of time nobody could later fully explain that absence went unnoticed, buried under the sheer scale of what everyone was already looking at. What remained, in the immediate aftermath, was a scene that resisted easy explanation. 3 people dead in one room, through violence loud enough that a neighbor woke to it in the night. 3 children asleep close enough to touch, apparently untouched and unaware. However, this night unfolded. Whoever moved through that cabin had made choices about who lived, who died, and who simply wasn't going to be considered a threat. The autopsies gave investigators a clearer, colder picture of what those blood patterns had already suggested. Sue Sharp died from a combination of knife wounds and blunt force trauma. Her throat had been cut, a wound that passed clean through her larynx. On the side of her head, examiners found an imprint they could match to a specific object, the butt of a pellet rifle, a Daisy model kept in the house. That detail alone tells you something about the pace of the attack. Whoever held that rifle wasn't using it to shoot. They were using it to strike. John's cause of death came down to the same combination: knife and blunt trauma. His throat slashed in a manner investigators considered consistent with the wound found on his mother. Dana died differently. His death came by strangulation, done by hand, along with head injuries from repeated blows. 2 bloodied knives turned up at the scene, one of them bent from the force used against it. A hammer sat nearby, also marked with blood. Whoever did this hadn't relied on one method or one weapon. They'd used whatever was close, and they'd used it more than once. Here's where the timeline gets its clearest anchor. A couple staying in cabin 16, not far from the Sharp house, woke around 1:15 to what they described as muffled screaming. They couldn't tell where it was coming from. Sound behaves strangely in a canyon at night, bouncing off rock and tree line, arriving from nowhere in particular. They listened for a moment, heard nothing more, and went back to sleep. That single detail, a scream half heard and then dismissed, sits at the center of this case. Somebody, somewhere close enough to hear it, had a chance to act. Nobody did, because nobody could tell what they were hearing, or where it was coming from, or that 3 people were dying while they lay in bed deciding whether to get up. Beyond the bodies themselves, the house told investigators something just as important through what it lacked. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere, no broken window, no splintered door frame, nothing to suggest someone had fought their way inside. The phone had been left off the hook. The lights throughout the house were switched off. The drapes were drawn shut. Somebody had gone through this house after the violence and made deliberate choices about what it should look like. choices that suggested calm, not chaos. A killer running on adrenaline doesn't usually pause to close curtains. And that's the piece of this case that refuses to sit comfortably, no matter how many times investigators have gone back over it. In one room, 3 people endured an attack, violent enough to leave blood on the ceiling. In every other direction from that room, there was nothing. No forced door, no broken glass, no struggle that spilled into a hallway or a bedroom. 3 children slept through it without stirring. Neighbors heard only a scream they couldn't place. Once, briefly, then silence again. A killer capable of that much violence in one space was also capable of total control everywhere else in that house. That contradiction, savagery in one room and total composure in every other, is what makes Cabin 28 different from an ordinary act of rage. It reads less like chaos and more like something planned down to its aftermath. Somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, a fact sat unnoticed that should have been the first thing anyone checked. Sue had 5 children. 3 bodies were in the living room. 3 children were unharmed in the bedroom. That's 4 accounted for. Tina, 12 years old, wasn't among either group, and for hours, in a scene crowded with officers, neighbors, and grieving family, nobody connected those numbers. It wasn't until well into the morning that someone finally asked the question out loud. Where is Tina? Sit with that for a second. A house full of law enforcement, a crime scene already documented in photographs, and the absence of a 12-year-old girl simply didn't register until the initial shock had passed. That gap in time, however it happened, meant the search for Tina started hours behind where it should have. Once investigators recognized what they were dealing with, the case shifted shape. This wasn't only a triple homicide anymore. It now carried the possibility of an abduction, and that brought federal law enforcement into a town that had never had reason to deal with the FBI before. Agents treated Tina's disappearance as a likely abduction tied to the murders, working alongside state and county investigators through the following weeks. That involvement didn't last. By the end of April, reporting at the time noted the FBI had pulled back, stating the State Department of Justice was handling the search adequately and that federal presence wasn't necessary. In hindsight, that withdrawal reads as premature, a decision made before anyone actually knew whether the case was being handled well at all. What the search did produce was methodical and grim in its thoroughness. Investigators organized a grid search covering a 5-mile radius around Cabin 28, bringing in police dogs to cover ground on foot that cars and roads couldn't reach, working through forest, brush, and the kind of uneven Sierra Nevada terrain that swallows small details easily. Teams walked that radius in sections, checking, marking, moving on. It was patient work, the kind that requires real manpower and real time. It turned up nothing. No trace of Tina, no clothing, no signs of struggle, nothing that gave the family or investigators anything to hold on to. The search area was exhausted, and still there was no answer. For Sue's surviving children, for the extended family trying to process 3 deaths while somehow also waiting for news of a 4th, that outcome meant grief without an ending. You can bury someone. You can hold a service, mark a date, begin whatever version of moving forward exists after something like this. None of that was available here. There was only the not knowing, stretching forward with no clear edge to it. That uncertainty would hold for 3 years. Whatever happened to Tina after she walked back into Cabin 28, that Saturday night stayed unanswered. Through 1981, through 1982, through 1983, while investigators turned their attention to the people who might have been in that living room in the first place, the question of where Tina was never went away. It just moved to the background, waiting, while the case turned toward the 2 men who'd been sitting in a bar in suits the night before the murders happened. 2 names surface again and again once the investigation turned toward the living, and both belonged to the cabin next door. Martin Smart lived in Cabin 26 with his wife Marilyn and her son Justin, the same boy who'd been found unharmed feet from 3 dead bodies. Staying with the Smarts that week was a friend of Martin's, a man named John Boubidet, who went by Beau. Boubedet was an ex-convict, and according to the people who knew him, he carried alleged ties to organized crime out of Chicago. He'd been in Keddie only a matter of days before the murders happened. Smart gave investigators a detail early on that would follow him for the rest of his life. He told them a hammer had gone missing from his cabin, sometime around the time of the killings. He couldn't explain where it went. He just knew it wasn't where it should have been. Investigators already had a bloodied hammer sitting in evidence, recovered from the scene, and Smart's own account put a matching tool unaccounted for in the house right next door. Meanwhile, the only person who claimed to have seen anything that night was 12-year-old Justin Smart, and his story didn't arrive whole. It came out in pieces, changing shape over multiple interviews, at one point emerging under hypnosis, a technique with a track record of producing memories that feel real without necessarily being reliable. From that testimony, investigators built composite sketches of two unknown men. The problem is who they used to build them. The sketches came from Harlan Embry, a local volunteer with no training in forensic art, no background in translating witness memory into an accurate likeness, at a time when the Department of Justice and the FBI both had trained forensic artists available. Nobody has ever explained why an amateur got the job instead. What stands out now, in retrospect, is what people in town remembered about the night before the murders. Martin Smart and Boubedet had been seen at the Backdoor Lounge, the local bar, dressed in suits and ties, an odd choice for a Friday night in a town of fewer than 50 people. Witnesses described them behaving unusually, drawing attention in a place where everyone already knew, everyone and strangers stood out fast. None of this proves anything on its own. But here's the twist. Circumstantial details like this tend to matter more in a town this small, where two men in suits acting strange the night before, a quadruple homicide isn't background noise. It's the kind of thing people remember for decades. Sheriff Doug Thomas made a decision early in the investigation that would shape everything downstream from it. Rather than requesting homicide investigators from the state, he called the California Department of Justice in Sacramento and asked for agents from their organized crime unit. Given Boubedet's alleged background, that request wasn't random, but it meant the two specialists sent to examine a quadruple homicide weren't trained to build a murder case. They were trained to track criminal organizations. And within days, both men were gone. Smart and Boubedet left Plumas County without being held, without formal charges, free to return to whatever lives waited for them elsewhere. Sheila Sharp would later say she'd been told the suspects were told to leave town, a detail that, if true, points to something closer to decision than oversight. Martin Smart died in 2006. John Boubedet died in 1988, back in Chicago. Neither man was ever charged with anything connected to Cabin 28, and neither one lived long enough to answer for what investigators, decades later, would come to believe they knew. 3 months into the case, Sheriff Doug Thomas made another decision that raises questions to this day. He resigned as sheriff of Plumas County and took a new position with the Sacramento Department of Justice, the same agency that had sent the organized crime agents in the first place. The man who'd overseen the original response to Cabin 28, who'd chosen to call in specialists trained for something other than homicide, was now working inside the very department that had shaped how this case got handled. Whatever the reasoning behind that move, it meant fresh eyes never really came to this investigation. The people involved just kept changing offices. Some evidence from that original scene never led anywhere at all. Investigators recovered an unidentified fingerprint from the handrail on the back stairs, the same stairs Jamie Seabolt had used when he went in to check for survivors. That print was never matched to anyone, not the victims, not the suspects, not the neighbors who moved through that scene in the chaos of that morning. It sat in the case file for decades, a piece of physical evidence with no name attached to it. What stands out now in retrospect, though, is a letter. After Smart left Keddie, he wrote to his estranged wife, Marilyn, working through what reads like the wreckage of a marriage. Buried in that letter was a line that would take investigators over 30 years to treat with the weight it deserved. "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives. 4 lives, written by a man whose stepson had slept, unharmed, in a bedroom feet from where 3 people died, while a 4th remained missing. That letter sat unexamined, never entered as evidence for decades. Around the same time, a VA counselor who treated Smart for what he described as combat-related trauma later reported something just as direct. According to that counselor, Smart admitted to killing Sue and Tina Sharp outright, adding that he didn't have anything to do with the boys. When this account reached the Department of Justice, it was dismissed as hearsay, a second-hand claim without the standing to reopen a case the state considered settled. No follow-up interview. No renewed pressure on Smart. The confession, if that's what it was, went into a file and stayed there. And then there's Marilyn. On the same day the murders were discovered, she left her husband. At the time, that departure could have meant almost anything. The end of a marriage already under strain, timing that was simply coincident. But here's the twist. Knowing what came later, the letter, the alleged confession, that timing reads differently now. A wife walking out the exact day 3 bodies turn up next door isn't proof of anything by itself. It's the kind of detail that only gains its full weight once you know what would come after it. None of this points to a case too strange to solve. It points to a case where the people responsible for solving it kept making choices that closed doors instead of opening them. A sheriff who left for the agency running the investigation. A letter nobody read. A confession nobody followed up on. A fingerprint nobody matched. What happened at Cabin 28 wasn't a mystery. Not really. It was a failure, built decision by decision, by people who had the chance to do this differently. 3 years passed with Tina's disappearance, unresolved. Then, in April of 1984, a man out collecting bottles near Feather Falls, in neighboring Butte County, roughly 30 miles from Keddie, came across a human skull. Along with it, he found part of a jawbone. He reported it, and the remains went to a forensic pathologist for identification. The confirmation came that June, the skull, belonged to Tina Sharp. For 3 years, her family had lived inside a question with no shape to it, no timeline, no resolution to plan around. Now there was an answer, and it closed one loop while it opened several others. How had she ended up 30 miles away, in a different county entirely? What had happened to her in the time between that Saturday night and whatever brought her remains to that specific stretch of ground near Feather Falls? The pathologist's findings gave the family a confirmation. They didn't give anyone a timeline, and they didn't give anyone a cause of death investigators could point to with certainty. Near where the skull was found, searchers recovered a handful of items: a child's blanket, a blue jacket, a pair of jeans, and an empty tape dispenser, the kind used for medical tape, the same material that had bound Sue, John, and Dana back in Cabin 28. Handled with the restraint this kind of discovery calls for, these items were logged as evidence, quiet, physical fragments that tied the scene at Feather Falls back to the scene in that living room 3 years earlier, even without answering the larger question of what happened to Tina in between. Shortly after the discovery became public, the Butte County Sheriff's Office received a phone call. The caller was anonymous and specific, naming the location where Tina's remains had turned up before that detail had been widely circulated. It was the kind of call that should have become a lead. Investigators chased immediately. Someone with knowledge that pointed toward involvement, or at minimum, toward information nobody else had. Instead, the call was never logged. No formal record, no documented follow-up. A recording of it existed, but that recording sat inside an evidence box, sealed and untouched, until 2013. When investigators reopening the case finally found it at the bottom of the file. That gap, nearly 30 years between a call coming in and anyone actually reviewing it, isn't really a mystery. It's not evidence of some grand scheme keeping the truth buried. It's what institutional neglect looks like in practice. A piece of evidence filed instead of followed. A department moving on to other cases while a taped call sat forgotten in storage. The Keddie investigation had already shown a pattern of this by 1984. Evidence overlooked, leads not pursued, decisions made that closed doors rather than opened them. The anonymous call was simply the next entry in that pattern, and it would take 3 more decades before anyone treated it as urgent. By the time that tape resurfaced, the case had passed through the hands of investigators who'd retired, moved on, or died, carrying whatever they'd known with them. What remained was a cold case file, a missing girl finally accounted for, and a set of suspects who'd never faced charges. It would take a new sheriff, a new investigator, and a fresh look at everything Plumas County had let sit untouched to bring Cabin 28 back into the light. That fresh look finally came in 2013, when Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood and Special Investigator Mike Gamberg decided to pull the Keddie file back open. Hagwood wasn't an outsider to this story. He'd been 16 years old at the time of the murders, living in the same small world the Sharps had lived in, and he knew the weight this case still carried in a county that size. Gamberg went through the file page by page, and near the bottom of an old evidence box, he found the sealed tape of that anonymous 1984 phone call, the one that had named Tina's location before anyone else knew it. Nearly 30 years untouched, and it was still there, waiting. The case didn't stay quiet for long after that. In March of 2016, investigators recovered a hammer from a dried-up pond near the old crime scene. Its description matched the tool Martin Smart had told investigators was missing from his cabin all the way back in 1981. Hagwood was direct about what that discovery meant. In his words, the location where it turned up wasn't the kind of place a hammer ends up by accident. It would have been put there on purpose. A tool doesn't drift into a dried pond on its own. Somebody carried it there, and somebody made a choice about where to leave it. 2 years after that, the case produced its most significant development yet. In 2018, Gamberg confirmed that DNA recovered from tape found at the crime scene had been matched to a living person, someone still walking around, still reachable, more than 3 decades after Cabin 28. Investigators handled that detail with real caution. A DNA match on old evidence doesn't equal a conviction, and it doesn't answer, on its own, what role that person played that night. But it did something the case hadn't had in years. It connected a piece of physical evidence to somebody who could still, in theory, answer for it. That match lines up with something Hagwood has said plainly in interviews since reopening the case. He doesn't believe one person walked into Cabin 28 alone. His stated belief is that multiple people were involved, not just in the killings themselves, but in what came after. Moving evidence, staying quiet, letting suspects leave the county without being held. And by his account, some of those people are still alive today, which means the story of Cabin 28 isn't strictly historical. It's a case with living stakes, sitting in a file that never actually closed. The physical setting itself is gone now. Cabin 28 stood for over 20 years after the murders, a structure nobody could quite bring themselves to use until the county condemned and demolished it in 2004. Where the house once stood is empty ground now. No foundation, no marker, nothing to indicate that 4 lives ended, or nearly ended, in that exact spot. The evidence that mattered most, wherever it went, didn't leave with the walls. It left decades earlier, the moment nobody logged that phone call, the moment a letter sat unread, the moment 2 men were told to leave town. What's left is a case suspended between 2 different kinds of truth. Investigators know things now they didn't know in 1981. A hammer placed with intent, a DNA match to someone still living, a confession that was never chased down when it might have mattered. And yet none of it has translated into an arrest. None of it has stood in front of a jury. Knowing and proving have never been the same thing, and Cabin 28 sits exactly in that gap. A case where the department finally believes it understands what happened without ever having been able to say so in a courtroom.